The girl grew up in a place where silence spoke louder than words. Her village sat between wide fields and low hills, a place where mornings were slow and evenings came with long shadows. People followed old ways without asking why. Doors were locked before dark. Fires were put out early. Certain paths were never taken at night and certain questions were never asked at all. From a young age, she learned that rules did not always come with reasons. Her mother was the one who taught her those rules. Every morning, her mother braided her hair carefully, fingers gentle but firm. Every night, she checked the doors twice and pulled the curtains tight. Love filled their small home, but fear lived there too, quiet and heavy, like smoke that never fully cleared. The girl did not know where that fear came from. She only knew it had shaped her mother long before she was born. There was one rule that stood above all others. It was spoken softly but never forgotten. Never pick flowers at midnight. Her mother said it the first time when the girl was very young. They had been walking near the edge of the fields, where wildflowers grew thick and bright during the day. The girl had reached out, curious, drawn to their colors. Her mother's hand closed around her wrist at once. Not hard. Not angry. Just afraid. Her face went pale and her grip trembled. Never pick flowers at midnight, she said, her voice low and tight. Especially not from that place. That place. The girl followed her mother's eyes toward the far edge of the fields, where the land dipped and the grass grew darker. Even in daylight, that part of the land felt different. The flowers there were taller, their colors deeper, almost glowing as the sun fell. The girl nodded, though she did not understand. As the years passed, the warning returned again and again. Sometimes it came gently, like advice passed down with care. Other times it came sharp, filled with fear that startled the girl more than the words themselves. Never at midnight. Never from the old field. Promise me. Her mother never explained why. When the girl asked, her mother's face would close off, like a door being shut. Her eyes would drift somewhere far away, to a place filled with memories she did not want to touch. Some things are better left alone, she would say. The girl learned not to push. But curiosity does not die easily. The forbidden flowers became a quiet presence in her life. During the day they looked harmless, even beautiful. Their petals were full and soft, colors deeper than anything else in the fields. At sunset they seemed to glow as if holding light inside them. At night no one went near them. The village never spoke openly about the field, but silence has its own language. Conversation stopped when the topic came close. Older people crossed themselves when they passed the path leading there. Children were pulled indoors long before midnight. The girl noticed these things as she grew older. She noticed how laughter faded near the edge of the land. How stories ended too soon. How some names were never spoken again. Her mother watched her closely during those years. Love shaped every warning, but fear shaped it too. Fear that had roots deep in the past. Fear that lived in her mother's eyes when she thought the girl wasn't looking. At night, the girl sometimes woke to hear her mother crying softly. Not loudly. Never enough to call attention. Just quiet sobs, filled with pain that had nowhere to go. The girl would lie still, heart racing, unsure if she should speak or stay silent. By morning, her mother would smile again. Breakfast would be ready. Life would continue. But the fear remained. As the girl grew, so did her questions. Why midnight? Why flowers? Why that place? Old stories drifted through the village like broken pieces of glass. People whispered about those who had gone into the fields at night and never come back the same. Some disappeared. Others returned quiet, empty, as if part of them had been left behind. The girl listened from corners and doorways, her curiosity growing stronger than her fear. She began to understand that the warning was not just a rule. It was a wound. Something had happened long ago, something tied to love and loss and regret. Something her mother carried alone. The flowers were part of that story. They bloomed most fully at night, opening under the moon as if drawn to darkness instead of light. People said they marked places where sorrow had soaked into the ground, where tears had fallen and never dried. Forgotten souls, some whispered. The girl did not know if she believed that. But she knew this. The warning was heavy with emotion. It was soaked in love, fear, and guilt passed from one heart to another. She wanted to obey her mother. She truly did. Yet each time she saw the flowers, something inside her stirred. A longing not just for beauty but for answers. For truth. For understanding the fear that ruled her mother's life. Obedience felt safe. Curiosity felt alive. And somewhere between love and fear, innocence began to crack. The warning that shaped her childhood did not protect her from the truth. It only delayed it. As the girl stood at the edge of the fields one evening, watching the sun sink low, she felt it clearly for the first time. The land was waiting. and one day she would step forward. The land beyond the village looked ordinary at first glance. During the day, the fields stretched wide and calm, filled with tall grass that moved gently with the wind. Birds flew low and insects hummed softly. Children played near the safer edges and farmers worked the soil as they always had. From a distance, nothing about the place seemed dangerous. But the girl knew better now. She had learned that some things change when the sun goes down. As evening came, the air grew cooler, heavier. Shadows stretched longer, bending and twisting across the ground. The colors of the land deepened, especially near the old field. The flowers there stood taller than the rest, their petals thick and dark, holding color even as light faded. When night arrived, the land felt awake. After midnight, silence settled in a way that felt unnatural. No insects buzzed. No birds cried out. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The girl noticed this long before anyone spoke of it. She felt it in her chest, a tightness that came without warning. The village pretended not to notice. People locked their doors earlier than necessary. Lamps were blown out quickly. Footsteps hurried home when the moon rose high. If someone glanced toward the old field, it was only for a moment, followed by a quick turn away. No one spoke openly about why. The girl grew up watching these small acts of fear. She noticed how adults changed when the subject came close. Their voices lowered. Their faces hardened. Conversations ended suddenly, as if an invisible line had been crossed. She learned that silence was a kind of rule too. At the edge of the land stood the path no one used at night. During the day, it looked worn but harmless, leading toward the old field where the flowers grew wild. Children were allowed to walk near it under the sun, but never beyond a certain point. At night, the path disappeared into darkness. The girl once asked an elder why no one went there after midnight. The old woman only shook her head and told her to stay close to home. Her eyes were filled with something heavy, something that looked like memory mixed with regret. Over time, pieces of the past began to reach the girl, though never all at once. She heard about a young man who went walking at night and returned days later, quiet and distant, never the same again. She heard about a woman who vanished near the field, her name spoken only once before disappearing from conversation forever. Some said the land took things. Others said it gave them back broken. No one agreed on the details, but everyone agreed on one thing. The land remembered. As the girl grew older, she began to see how adults lied without words. They smiled while hiding fear. They warned without explaining. They protected by staying silent, believing silence was kindness. But silence only made the mystery grow. The girl noticed how her mother stiffened whenever they passed near the fields. Her hand would tighten slightly, her steps quicken. Her eyes stayed fixed ahead, never wandering toward the flowers. Once, the girl noticed her mother whispering under her breath as they walked past, as if speaking to someone who was not there. The girl did not ask who. She began to understand that the land was more than soil and grass. It held memories the way people did. Pain soaked into it over time, settling deep where roots grew and shadows slept. At night, when the moon was full, the flowers seemed brighter. Their petals opened wide, facing the sky as if waiting. The girl watched them from her window more than once, feeling both drawn and afraid. The air near the field always felt colder, even in summer. Sounds carried strangely there, fading too fast or echoing too long. Once, the girl thought she heard crying carried on the wind, but when she listened closer, there was nothing. Just silence. As years passed, fear lost some of its power. The girl was no longer a child who accepted rules without question. She noticed the cracks in adult stories. She saw how warnings changed depending on who spoke them. She saw how people avoided truth not because it was false but because it hurt. She began to feel the pull of the land more strongly. Curiosity grew quietly like a seed planted long ago. It pushed against fear, testing its strength. Each unanswered question made it grow. Why did the flowers bloom only at night? Why did the land feel alive after midnight? Why did her mother carry so much pain tied to a place she refused to name? The girl walked closer to the fields during the evenings now, stopping just short of where the ground dipped. She stood there watching the light fade, feeling the air change. She felt watched sometimes, though she could never say by what. The land did not feel angry. It felt sad. As if it held too many stories with no one left to tell them. She began to believe that the land remembered everything. Every step taken in fear. Every tear that fell. Every promise broken and never repaired. The village tried to forget. The land did not. One evening, as the moon rose slowly into the sky, the girl realized something that made her heart race. Fear had been passed down to protect her. But curiosity had grown to guide her. And slowly, without meaning to, she understood that the land was not calling her to harm. It was calling her to listen. As she turned back toward home, the flowers swayed gently in the night breeze, their dark petals glowing softly under the moon. The land was waiting. And the girl was no longer sure she wanted to turn away. The night it happened did not begin with thunder or warnings. It began quietly like any other night. The village settled into sleep as it always did. Lamps went dark one by one. Doors were bolted. The soft sounds of evening faded until only the slow breath of the land remained. From her bed, the girl stared at the ceiling, unable to rest. Sleep would not come. Her thoughts circled the same place they had returned to for years. The field, the flowers, the rule that had followed her since childhood. Never pick flowers at midnight. The words echoed in her mind, heavy and familiar. She listened to her mother's breathing from the next room. Slow, steady, safe. The girl's heart beat faster with each passing minute. Outside, the moon climbed higher, its pale light slipping through the window. Shadows stretched across the floor, long and thin, reaching toward her like fingers. She checked the time again. Midnight was close. Fear rose inside her, sharp and cold. She knew what she was about to do. She knew the rule she was about to break. Every warning she had ever been given pressed down on her chest. But beneath the fear was something stronger. A longing she could no longer ignore. She wanted to understand the land. She wanted to understand her mother. She wanted to understand the sadness that had shaped her life without ever explaining itself. The girl sat up slowly, careful not to make a sound. The house felt different at night, full of shadows and quiet memories. She slipped her feet onto the floor, feeling the cold seep into her skin. Her hands trembled. This was not rebellion for the sake of defiance. This was a search for truth. She moved through the house like a ghost, opening the door with care. The night air brushed against her face, cool and damp. The world outside felt larger, heavier, as if it were holding its breath. The path toward the fields lay open before her. Each step forward felt like crossing a line she could never step back over. Her heart pounded, loud in her ears. The moon lit the ground just enough for her to see, casting silver light across the grass. The closer she came to the old field, the colder the air grew. The silence deepened. No insects, no wind, no distant sounds from the village. Only her footsteps. She stopped at the edge of the land, the place where everyone else turned back. Her body urged her to stop. Fear wrapped around her, tight and insistent. She thought of her mother's eyes, filled with love and terror. She thought of the stories left unfinished. She stepped forward. The ground dipped beneath her feet as she entered the forbidden space. It felt like crossing into another world. The flowers stood tall before her, their dark petals open wide under the moon. They were more beautiful than she had imagined. Their scent filled the air, sweet, heavy, and unfamiliar. Her breath caught. For a moment, she only stood there, frozen between fear and wonder. The flowers seemed to glow softly, their colors deeper than anything she had seen in daylight. They swayed gently, though there was no wind. The girl reached out slowly, her hand hovering above the petals. Her heart raced. She hesitated, feeling the weight of every warning pressed down on her. She told herself she could still turn back. She told herself this was enough, that seeing them was already a mistake. But curiosity pushed her forward. Her fingers brushed the petals. The touch sent a strange shiver through her body, like a memory that was not her own. The air around her shifted, growing heavier, thicker, as if the land itself had noticed her presence. She closed her eyes and picked the flower. The sound was soft, almost gentle, but it echoed loudly in her chest. As the stem broke free, the night seemed to change. The silence deepened, pressing in on her from all sides. The scent of the flower grew stronger. Her heart pounded as she held it in her hand, its petals warm against her skin. A strange sadness washed over her, sudden and overwhelming. Images flickered through her mind, faces she did not recognize, tears she had never shed, voices calling out in pain and longing. She gasped, staggering back. The air around her felt alive now, charged with something unseen. The shadows shifted, stretching closer. The moonlight dimmed, as if covered by an invisible veil. The girl felt it then. A presence. She was no longer alone. The land was watching her. Her breath came fast and shallow as fear finally caught up with her curiosity. She clutched the flower tightly, unsure whether to drop it or run. Every part of her screamed that something had been awakened. She turned and ran, her feet barely touching the ground as she fled the field. The silence followed her, thick and heavy, until she crossed back into the safer ground beyond the dip. Only then did the night sound slowly return. By the time she reached her house, her hands were shaking. She slipped inside, heart racing, and hid the flower beneath her pillow, unsure why she could not bring herself to let it go. As she lay awake, staring into the darkness, one truth settled deep inside her. The rule had been broken, and something ancient and unfinished had noticed. The first sign came before the sun rose. The girl dreamed of voices she did not know. They whispered her name from far away, soft and broken as if carried through water. She saw places she had never been, faces blurred by tears, hands reaching out and never touching. The dreams were heavy, pressing down on her chest until she woke with a sharp gasp. Her heart raced. For a moment she did not know where she was. Then she remembered the flower. It lay hidden beneath her pillow, its presence clear even without touch. The air around it felt warmer than the rest of the room, filled with a scent that did not belong inside her home. She sat up slowly, fear creeping into her thoughts. The night had not let her go. As morning light slipped through the window, the world looked the same. Birds sang. The village stirred. Life continued as if nothing had changed. But the girl had. Her body felt heavy, as if she had carried someone else's grief through the night. Every sound seemed louder. Every shadow lingered longer than it should. She moved through the house quietly, avoiding her mother's eyes. Her mother noticed anyway. She always did. At breakfast, her mother studied her face for a moment too long. Her smile faltered just slightly. Her hand paused in mid-motion as if she sensed something she could not see. "Are you feeling well?" she asked softly. The girl nodded, unable to speak. Fear rose in her chest. Not fear of punishment, but fear of being seen too clearly. The day passed slowly. The girl found it hard to focus, her thoughts drifting back to the field, to the moment the stem broke in her hand. At times she thought she heard someone calling her, only to find empty air. By afternoon, the flower's scent seemed to follow her. No one else noticed. But she did. That night, the dreams returned. This time they were clearer. She saw a young woman standing in the moonlight, her face filled with sorrow. She saw the old field as it had been long ago, untouched and full of life. She felt heartbreak so sharp it made her chest ache. She woke crying, tears wet on her cheeks. The girl pressed her hand to her mouth, stifling the sound. Her body shook with emotion she did not understand. The grief felt too big, too old to belong to her. When she finally fell back asleep, the dreams did not fade. They followed her into the days that came after. Small things began to change. The house felt colder even in the afternoon. Shadows lingered at the edges of rooms. The girl sometimes felt fingers brush past her, gentle and fleeting, leaving behind a chill. Once, she heard footsteps behind her when she was alone. Another time, she caught her reflection in the mirror looking back with eyes filled with sadness she did not feel in that moment. Her mother grew quieter. She watched her daughter with growing concern, her eyes filled with a fear she tried to hide. At night, the girl heard her mother pacing the house, whispering words meant for no one. The distance between them grew, not from anger, but from unspoken dread. The girl began to understand that the flower was not just a flower. It carried something with it. Memories, pain, regret. Late one evening, as the girl sat alone, the room filled with a strange heaviness. The air grew thick, pressing down on her chest. Her breath came short and fast as images flooded her mind. She saw people walking into the field at midnight, drawn by grief or longing. She felt their fear, their hope, their sorrow when they realized they could not undo their choice. The land had taken their pain, and it had waited. The girl realized then that the flowers were tied to unfinished lives. They bloomed where grief had sunk into the soil, fed by tears and regret. Picking them was not an act of beauty, it was a reopening of wounds long buried. She had awakened something that had been waiting for someone to notice. Her mother sensed the change before the girl ever spoke. One night, her mother stood in the doorway watching her sleep. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with panic she could no longer hide. She reached out, stopping just short of touching her daughter. "Something is wrong," she whispered. The girl pretended to sleep, guilt twisting in her chest. She wanted to confess. She wanted to explain. But fear held her silent. Fear of hurting her mother. Fear of confirming her worst fears. The presence grew stronger. At times, the girl felt emotions wash over her without warning. Love so deep it ached, regret so sharp it stole her breath. She heard whispers carried on the wind when she passed near the fields, calling her closer. The land was no longer quiet. It had been awakened. And it was unfinished. As the girl lay awake one night, staring at the ceiling, she understood something that made her chest tighten. The cost of her choice was not punishment. It was responsibility. The land had given her its pain. and it would not let her go until it was seen, heard, and remembered. The truth did not arrive all at once. It crept into the house slowly, carried by sleepless nights and heavy silences. The girl could feel it pressing against her chest, waiting for a moment when it could no longer be held back. Her mother was unraveling. The woman who had always seemed strong, careful, and in control now moved through the house like someone carrying an invisible weight. Her hands shook when she poured water. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor for long moments, lost in places the girl could not follow. At night, the girl heard her mother crying again. But this time the sobs were deeper, older, filled with guilt that had been locked away for too long. The girl knew the time for silence was ending. One evening, as the sun dipped low and shadows filled the corners of the house, her mother sat at the table without touching her food. Her face was pale, her lips pressed into a thin line. Her mother finally looked up. Her eyes met the girl's, and in them was a fear more painful than anger. "You went there, didn't you?" The words were quiet, but they struck like thunder. The girl's breath caught. Her heart pounded in her ears. She wanted to lie to protect them both, but the weight of everything she had seen and felt pressed down on her. She nodded. The room fell silent. Her mother closed her eyes, pain crossing her face like a wave. When she opened them again, they were filled with tears she did not bother to hide. "I tried to stop this," she whispered. "I tried so hard." The girl felt tears spill down her own cheeks. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she said softly. "I just wanted to understand." Her mother let out a shaky breath and nodded slowly. "I know," she said. "That's why I'm afraid." They sat together in silence, the space between them heavy with unspoken truth. At last her mother reached for the girl's hand. Her grip was tight, desperate. "Happened to me too." The words felt like a door opening. Her mother's voice trembled as she spoke, each memory pulled from deep inside her. She had been young once, curious and full of hope. She had stood at the edge of the same field, drawn by the same flowers. She had broken the same rule. There had been someone she loved then. Someone who walked beside her into the night, believing beauty could not harm them. Believing the old stories were nothing more than fear passed down without reason. They picked the flowers together. The night changed. The land had awakened. Her mother spoke of dreams filled with sorrow that did not belong to her. Of voices calling her name. Of guilt so heavy it made breathing hard. But she had survived. The one she loved had not. He had faded slowly, growing quiet and distant, as if part of him had been left behind in the field. One night he went back alone. He never returned. Her mother's voice broke as she spoke his name, a name the girl had never heard before. Tears streamed down her face, unchecked and raw. "I thought if I never spoke of it, it would stay buried," she said. "I thought silence would keep you safe." The girl squeezed her hand, her own heart breaking. "But silence didn't heal you," she said. Her mother nodded, grief twisting her features. "Silence became my shield," she said. "And my prison." She had lived with that guilt for years, believing she deserved the pain. She had feared the land ever since, avoided it, warned her child with desperation born from loss. She thought love alone would be enough. But love could not erase the past. The flower beneath the girl's pillow seemed to hum, as if responding to the truth spoken aloud. The air in the room felt lighter, but the fear remained. "The land remembers," her mother said quietly. "It always remembers. And now it remembers you." The girl realized then that the warning had never been about control. It had been about fear. Fear of loss. Fear of history repeating itself. Fear of facing a pain too deep to touch. They sat together long into the night, mother and daughter bound by the same wound, passed from one generation to the next. The truth had finally been spoken. But speaking it was only the beginning. As the moon rose high, casting pale light through the window, the girl understood what came next. The past could no longer be ignored. And love alone would not be enough to stop what had been awakened. The nights grew heavier after the truth was spoken. The girl no longer slept peacefully. Even when she closed her eyes, shadows moved behind her eyelids, and whispers drifted through the corners of her room. Sometimes she awoke to the sensation of someone standing beside her bed, though no one was there. The air would be thick and sweet with the scent of the flowers she had taken, and the weight in her chest would press down until she could hardly breathe. She began to notice small changes in the world around her. The wind no longer blew softly across the fields. It carried murmurs that sounded like crying or laughter, sometimes both at once. The village, which had once felt safe, seemed to shrink under the weight of these new sounds. Even familiar streets and rooms felt different, as if the land itself was remembering her every step, marking her presence. Her mother's fear had not diminished. If anything, it had grown, layered now with the pain of memories neither could escape. She would watch the girl from across the room, sometimes silently, sometimes whispering fragments of old warnings. The girl felt her mother's eyes on her even when she tried to leave the house, and she realized that the burden of the past was shared between them now. The flowers were not just flowers. They were echoes of grief, love, betrayal, and regret, carried through time and soil. Every night, the girl felt these emotions wash over her, unbidden and unearned. Some nights, she woke crying for people she had never met, people whose lives had ended in silence, abandoned by history. Their pain filled her mind like a flood, leaving her exhausted and trembling. The land itself became a mirror of her inner turmoil. The field seemed to change shape in the moonlight, stretching longer, darkening deeper. Shadows moved in ways that didn't follow the wind, and faint shapes appeared at the edges of vision, gone when she blinked. She understood instinctively that the land was not malicious. It was remembering. It was reflecting everything left unresolved. At school and in the village, her presence began to feel heavier. People would glance at her and look away quickly, as if sensing the weight she carried. Friends who once laughed with her now seemed distant, and conversations felt shallow. She had begun to walk through life carrying something invisible, something that made her different even from herself. She tried to ignore it, tried to pretend that the flower beneath her pillow was just a flower, that the whispers were just the wind, that the pain in her chest would fade. But it did not fade. It only grew, settling deeper into her bones. One evening she returned to the edge of the field. The moonlight spilled across the dark petals of the flowers, illuminating them like a soft, eerie glow. The girl felt their presence more intensely than ever. The air vibrated with the memory of every step, every hand that had ever touched them. She knew that the land was speaking to her now, through the weight of grief it had carried for centuries. The girl realized that the haunting was not punishment. It was a calling. She was meant to bear witness, to feel what others could not, to carry the sorrow and love that had been left behind. But she also realized how heavy that responsibility was. It demanded courage, endurance, and compassion. It demanded that she confront not only the land's pain, but her own. Each night she felt herself changing. The shadows were no longer just frightening, they were lessons. The whispers were not just cries, they were stories that needed to be understood. She began to recognize that the land's memory was a mirror for her own emotional inheritance. Every fear she carried, every piece of her mother's silence, every unanswered question now pressed against her heart. And yet, even as the weight pressed down, a strange clarity began to emerge. The haunting was teaching her empathy. It was forcing her to see beyond herself, to hold grief and love together in her hands. She began to understand the meaning of responsibility, not ownership, not guilt, but bearing witness, carrying what must be carried and finding a way to honor it. The flowers, once symbols of temptation and danger, now seemed to offer something else. They were a guide. A reminder that the path forward required courage, truth, and acceptance. To ignore them was to ignore history itself. To run was to leave sorrow unresolved. To stay and understand was to begin the long, painful work of redemption. One night, standing at the edge of the field, the girl whispered into the darkness, words meant for no one. "I will not run." The wind stirred, brushing the petals of the flowers, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible sigh in response. The land seemed to hold its breath, waiting. And the girl understood, in the depth of her bones, that the journey had only just begun. The haunting had deepened, yes, but with it came purpose. She would carry what needed to be carried. She would face the grief. She would bear witness. And perhaps, someday she would find a way to set it free. The night of confrontation came quietly, but with an intensity the girl could feel in her bones. The village was asleep. Lamps dimmed in windows, dogs had stopped barking, and even the wind seemed to pause. The moon hung high, a pale witness to what was about to unfold. The girl's heart thumped loudly, but this time it was not fear alone, it was determination. She had walked these fields many nights before, but never with purpose. Tonight she would face the truth. Her mother was beside her. The woman who had once warned, protected, and feared now stood in the shadows, steady and watchful. Her hands trembled slightly, but her gaze was firm. They did not speak as they stepped toward the edge of the old field. Words were unnecessary. Years of fear, silence, and grief had built a bond between them stronger than any conversation. The moonlight stretched across the dark petals of the flowers, their glow soft and eerie. The air was thick with memory, filled with whispers and sighs carried on the night wind. The girl could feel the presence of all those who had touched these grounds before, their grief lingering like smoke. It was overwhelming yet grounding. The mother spoke first, her voice low, trembling but steady. "This is where it began. This is where it ends. Are you ready?" The girl nodded, clutching the flower she had first taken long ago. It was no longer just a flower, it was a symbol of everything they carried. The grief, the love, the mistakes, the silences. They stepped together into the field. The ground felt alive beneath their feet, soft but unyielding. The flowers swayed gently, though there was no wind. Shadows deepened, reaching out like memories that had been waiting for acknowledgement. The girl felt herself trembling, not from fear, but from the weight of all that she and her mother were confronting. She whispered the names of those whose stories had haunted her, the ones whose grief had seeped into the soil, whose pain had called to her from the shadows. Her mother joined her in the whispers. She spoke the names of those she had loved and lost, of regrets that had never been voiced, of promises that had been broken. The night air carried their words, and the land seemed to listen, drawing the grief and love into its memory. A silence followed, deep and heavy. The girl closed her eyes and breathed slowly. She felt the weight of history, the sadness of countless souls, and yet also a strange relief. They were finally being seen, being remembered. She opened her eyes and saw her mother kneeling beside her, tears streaming silently down her face. The woman touched the petals of a flower, and for the first time, they seemed to bend toward her, as if acknowledging her presence, forgiving her past, and allowing the sorrow to lift slightly. "You carried it well," her mother whispered. "But now you must let it go." The girl held the flower tightly. She thought of the nights of fear, of whispers in the darkness, of dreams that had stolen her sleep. She thought of the pain she had felt that was not even hers alone. And then, slowly, deliberately, she placed the flower back among its kin. The act was small but immense. It was an acknowledgement that the grief, the mistakes, and the history did not belong to one person alone. They belonged to the land, to the memory of everyone who had ever walked this path. The night shifted. Shadows softened. The air grew lighter, carrying a faint sigh, almost like a blessing. The whispers quieted, no longer urgent, no longer pressing. For the first time, the girl felt a kind of peace, fragile but real, settle over the field. Her mother took her hand, gripping it tightly. "We cannot change what happened," she said. "But we can honor it. We can face it together. And that is how we heal." The girl nodded, tears streaming down her face. She realized that the fear and grief that had shaped her childhood were not enemies, they were teachers. They had guided her to this moment, to understanding, to courage. The two of them stood side by side, watching the flowers in the moonlight. The land no longer felt menacing. It felt alive in a different way, like a heart beating quietly, full of memory, sorrow, and hope. The girl understood something deeply, something she would carry for the rest of her life. Confronting fear, acknowledging grief, and embracing truth was not weakness. It was strength. And in the quiet of the night, mother and daughter, bound by love and shared history, finally began to heal. The field, once a place of warning and sorrow, had become a place of remembrance. And in that remembrance they found the first bloom of forgiveness. The nights after the confrontation were quieter. The girl no longer woke to whispers or shadows pressing in on her chest. Dreams that had once carried grief and sorrow now faded peacefully into morning light. The flower she had taken long ago had been returned to the field, and with it, a weight seemed to lift, not just from her but from the land itself. Her mother moved through the house differently too. Her shoulders were still heavy with memory, but there was a lightness in her step, a softness in her gaze. The fear that had haunted them both for years had not vanished, but it had been acknowledged, shared, and no longer controlled them. The girl and her mother walked the fields together, not out of curiosity but out of understanding. The flowers glowed gently in the moonlight, their petals soft and alive, no longer symbols of fear but of remembrance. She noticed how the land seemed to breathe beneath her feet, as if relieved to have its pain recognized. The village too began to change. Conversations that had once ended abruptly now lingered. Stories were told again, names remembered, and the weight of silence began to lift. People who had avoided the edge of the field for years now glanced toward it, a quiet respect in their eyes. The land had not been conquered, nor had it forgiven lightly, but acknowledgement had begun the healing. The girl realized that forgiveness was not something granted by others. It was something cultivated through courage and truth. By facing the land, by returning what had been taken, she had begun to untangle the grief that had bound her family for generations. Her mother stood beside her one night as they watched the moon rise over the field. She reached for her daughter's hand, and this time their fingers intertwined naturally, without the tremor of fear. "We have carried too much alone," her mother said softly. "But now we can carry it together." The girl nodded, understanding the depth of those words. Healing did not mean forgetting. It did not erase what had been lost, but it allowed space for growth, love, and hope to bloom where grief had once ruled. The flowers remained as they always would, but their meaning had changed. They no longer warned of danger or punishment. They stood as reminders of mistakes that had been made, of grief that had been carried, of courage that had faced the unknown, and of forgiveness that had been earned. In the quiet of the fields, the girl felt a sense of peace she had never known. She closed her eyes, breathed deeply, and listened, not for whispers, not for shadows, but for the rhythm of life itself. The land had remembered, and now it was ready to rest, as were they. And as the first light of dawn touched the petals of the flowers, the girl understood that growth, like the bloom of those midnight flowers, often comes from darkness, from fear, from facing the truth, and from choosing again and again to carry the weight of love, loss, and hope forward. The past had shaped them. The land had remembered. But now, through courage, acknowledgement, and forgiveness, what bloomed was more beautiful than any flower. Healing, understanding, and the quiet promise of a future where fear no longer ruled. The girl looked to her mother, and they smiled, a smile not of relief alone, but of recognition. They had faced the past together. They had faced the land together. And finally they were free to grow.